Stand therefore, having fastened the belt of truth around your waist, and having put on the breastplate of righteousness, and having shod your feet with the equipment of the gospel of peace. Besides all these, taking the shield of faith, with which you can quench the flaming darts of the evil one, and take the helmet of salvation and the sword of the Spirit, which is the word of God. Pray at all times in the Spirit, with all prayer and supplication. To that end, keep alert with all perseverance, making supplication for all the saints, and also for me, that utterance may be given me in opening my mouth boldly to proclaim the mystery of the gospel, for which I am an ambassador in chains, that I may declare it boldly as I ought to speak. This is the word of the Lord. My dear friends, it's a great joy and delight to be with you this evening as we come together to pray and to talk about prayer and what that means for our lives. I started with this because this is the words of St. Paul, who says not just one time, but several times in different passages throughout the scriptures, to pray at all times, or to pray without ceasing. And it's a sort of command, a sort of desire, a sort of hope for us all that is something really, really difficult to fulfill, really difficult to complete. I think it's actually a task that we're all called to do on some level throughout our lives, is to grow in this understanding of prayer, what it means for our lives, what God is calling to us in prayer. And so that's what this opportunity is tonight, this class is about, is prayer. And understanding what prayer is at its core, which is prayer of relationship, prayer of the heart, the longing for union with our God who made each and every one of us and who loves us dearly and who wants to call us ever more deeply into relationship. So we've got quite a bit to go through tonight, and we'll have quite a bit to go through the next 5 weeks. I sort of said at the beginning, if you can't be here for a week, that's okay. Everything will be recorded. But also, each week won't be built so much that you cannot pick up if you miss a week. It'll sort of build on itself a little bit, but there's still plenty of room. And I'll go through the schedule and what we have here, which kind of sets the pace, and you can understand where we're going and how this will work out. So the plan for tonight is I'm going to talk for about 40 minutes or so, give or take, depends on if there's a question or two. I'll warn you, I do have a tendency to go a little bit long, so that's the last thing you want to hear right at the start, but I'll try my best. And then we're going to pray. Each night that we come together, we will end praying together in some way, shape, or form. Because you can talk about prayer all you want, but unless you do it, unless you really give yourself to it, it's not going to sink in the way you kind of hope. So the plan overarching for tonight is just kind of do a little bit of introduction, why I think this is so important, where this sort of came from my own life, and what I want you to take away from tonight is sort of just this call to prayer, this sort of renewed commitment to a quiet interior life of relationship and prayer with God. And then at the end, we'll talk a little bit about what prayer is, what prayer isn't, and then I'll kind of leave you with a challenge. And in fact, every week I will leave you guys with a challenge. So I offered this class 5 years ago at Immaculate Heart of Mary Parish in Monona, and it went over really well. People loved it. I still talk with a number of people who will email me or ask questions about prayer and kind of their own thoughts, or they'll tell me what an influence it made in their life. And when I started that class, I sort of said, I am totally underqualified to teach this class. And I still stand by that absolutely right now before you. I am totally underqualified to teach this class because on some level you really can't quite teach prayer, right? Because we have one teacher in prayer, and that is Jesus Christ himself. It's the Holy Spirit who is the ultimate prayer guider, leader, whatever you want to call him. But what I think I can do is help give you a few tips, odds or ends, thoughts, my own experiences. And some of these may resound really well, some of them may not. We also have a varied audience, and online too. We have no idea who's doing this. So it's very difficult to try to condense everything into, 5 weeks of deep spiritual life, right? Not to mention the Catholic Church has 2,000 years of tradition, of histories, of different spiritualities and approaches to prayer. So we'll have to kind of balance all of that. So I also think that I'll actually learn quite a bit from you guys as well, because each person here has a unique relationship with Jesus Christ. Each person has a unique conversation, a dialogue, an encounter, a journey with Christ. And that may vary from each person. So what I say for some may be very mundane, for others maybe not. But what I've kind of narrowed things down, I think it will probably, something will stick with you. And even if you've been praying for 70 years and just deeply in love with the Lord, a different reminder, a different approach can always help strengthen that relationship as well. Okay? So, a little bit of the background of why I chose the term questioning prayer too, because this was actually a development that I just did for this class. I kind of changed the title, and I was praying about what we were going to talk about and how this was going to go. And the figure of Job came to mind. So the book of Job is an Old Testament book, and I'm not going to go super in-depth into that book, but you probably know a little bit about it. It's a book of a man who is in relationship with God and has everything taken away from him. And he's struggling, and he's tempted by the devil. He has friends that try to come and console him, but he's really complaining and questioning God on a number of different levels. And so I started to think about Job a little bit and how that relates to each of us. Because there are tons of people in our world today that question prayer. That question in the sense of, this doesn't work, you're wasting your time, you're fooling yourself, you're doing some psychological kind of mind games to make you think that this person who's invisible exists when he clearly doesn't. So that's what the kind of world says when they question prayer. And yet this figure of Job is really powerful because he questions prayer in a different way. He comes to the Lord with questions. He doesn't understand why things are happening to him, but he trusts the Lord, and in certain times he does actually complain. And this was actually a bit of a development for the Jewish people. The book of Job is an Old Testament book from the Jewish scriptures. So I think a lot of times we think that sometimes we just are forced to just suck it up in life, right? Things are rough, so we got to just deal with it and move on. And I think Job actually teaches us something different. That while we can question the Lord in a positive sense, we can ask the Lord, Lord, why are things happening the way they are? Lord, can you help me understand what my life is going through right now? Lord, I'm actually quite happy right now. I want to give you thanks for that. Can you help enter into that joy with me? Because that sort of honesty of questioning that Job had with God is the exact same honesty that he wants from all of us in prayer. When we approach the Lord in prayer, he wants our honest heart. If we're sad, if we're tired, if we're angry, if we're bored, which is a very common thing in prayer, to be bored, to tell him that, to talk to him about that. And just as if we were to greet a friend, the first thing that we would do to this friend is not ask them for something right away, but ask them how they're doing. To question them, see what's going on in their life. Now, that analogy may not work quite perfectly with the Lord, but it's still very strong, that it emphasizes the fact that prayer at its essence is about a relationship. And so relationship is going to be the sort of model that we use for prayer. Okay? So, That's enough for that, I think. So let's just go over a quick little bit of the logistics of how this is going to work. So it's sort of a strange setup a little bit. We're in a church, but it's somewhat of a classroom, kind of, not really, setting. But I'll have you open up the sheet of the schedule for how each week goes. So this is the questioning prayer, the course schedule. So I just wanted to kind of run through that ever so briefly and kind of show you what we're going to cover in these next 5 weeks. So this is the green sheet, if you had a chance to get that. So tonight, we've got the sessions that we're going to go over. And then with each session, I've highlighted chapters from the Catechism of the Catholic Church. So our primary references for this sort of course is going to be the Catechism of the Catholic Church. And then there'll also be another handout every week after this week. And just now is a good time to say online, if you are watching this online, the handouts are actually linked to the original questioning prayer YouTube page. In the description, those handouts are actually linked to that page, so anybody online can grab those as well. So you can see that the Catechism of the Catholic Church is actually an incredible resource. There's so much there, and it's divided into paragraphs. And those paragraphs are pretty lengthy sometimes, and the catechism itself can be very lengthy. But the entire 4th section of the catechism is dedicated to prayer. And I've sort of picked and chosen basically different highlights of prayer and organized them in a way that we can follow. And that is what this first sheet is right here, the questioning prayer, Catechism of the Catholic Church references. So if you can see that, and you kind of put the sheets side by side, there's paragraph numbers on the one, which corresponds to the paragraph numbers that we'll cover each time we come together, okay? So each week you come, you'll get a new catechism sheet, but if you want to look ahead, read ahead, we have catechisms available over here at the church. You can order one online if you don't have one. You can just look up catechism online. So if you just Google CCC and then the paragraph number that I have listed there, the first thing that will come up is the Vatican's website with the catechism references, okay? But I made it fairly easy in the sense of how this is going to flow. So each class will talk a little bit about the catechism, and as you can see, it will kind of build on itself ever so slightly. So next week we'll talk about vocal prayer, which is what the catechism talks about, 3 different types of prayer: vocal, meditation, and contemplation. So in week 2, we'll talk about vocal prayer. Week 3, we'll talk about meditation. And week 4, we'll talk about contemplation. And then I've added a couple of other extra little things surrounding each of those topics, okay? Now, at the beginning of each class, too, there's also something listed called Fundamentals Topic. And you'll see that starts next week. There are 4 fundamentals that we're going to go through. And that is obstacles to prayer, faith, practicing the presence of God, and prayer of the heart. So this takes a little bit of background, and this actually helps explain a little bit of this course. Because I'd said at Mass this past weekend, most of us learn to pray from our parents. And that's a beautiful way to learn how to pray. But we very rarely have sort of continuing education or continual guidance in prayer. My very first year of seminary, a priest went out of his way to talk to seminarians at the beginning of their 6 to 8 year journey and help teach them how to pray. And he taught this course, which I've loosely built some of my course around what he taught. But he taught this course on prayer, and he taught it through these 4 fundamentals of obstacles to prayer, faith, practicing the presence of God, and prayer of the heart. And he talked about that almost in a cycle, that every time you approach the Lord in prayer, you need to look at the obstacles of prayer in your life. You need to look at your faith and sort of make that act of faith to God. And that helps you come into the presence of God. Here in the church, it's so much easier because the presence of God is here substantially in the Eucharist, and we'll talk about that later. But then ultimately it comes to the core of prayer, which is about the heart, which is about sharing all of your heart and your soul, everything about yourself with God. So each week, starting next week, there'll be another handout with the Catechism, handouts with the sheets, that has just a number of quotes from various books, spiritual readings, all that sort of things. Those are just sort of, you'll see that next week, but that is just something to help kind of guide you through that specific topic, that fundamentals topic. Okay? And then the third part is this application prayer focus for each week. And that's where I said, we're not just going to talk about prayer, we're going to pray. So today at the end, I'll talk about exactly what we're going to do, but we'll actually spend a couple minutes in Eucharistic adoration together. In the following weeks, we'll talk about the Jesus prayer, something that's very powerful, just the name of Jesus as a prayer. Then the rosary, how we're going to talk about rosary, tying that in with meditation. Lectio Divina is praying with the scriptures. And then ultimately, kind of tying this all into praying with the Mass. Realizing what we can bring from an interior prayer life as we come to Mass. Okay? So that's sort of the layout for each week. I also put, in the past I actually had some additional references and resources, and some of those I've actually put out there because there's a couple of books that I've also found very helpful. And two of these books are called Prayer for Beginners by Peter Kreeft. This is an outstanding, very short book that is not just for beginners, that kind of talks through some of the topics that we're going to talk about. And it really just goes through a simple way of approaching God, especially that prayer of the presence of God, and building that into your life. The very first chapter of this book is on the necessity of prayer, and the title is Why Praying is More Important Than Eating. So that one was actually quite a favorite last year. So why praying is more important than eating. Depending on time, maybe I'll read that later, but we'll see from there. The other book is Time for God by Jacques Philippe. It's another very small book, short book, and it really talks about mental prayer, about raising your mind to God and how we do that in different settings, how we do that in different, how we prepare ourselves to meet the Lord in quiet, meditative, and contemplative prayer. Again, short book, very simple, but profound in what it teaches, okay? So I give you these, as these are sort of all of the resources and the references. Though I called these other two books kind of just additional readings, because some people love to read, some people want to know and go through everything that we've got. Some people would rather just come and listen, and that's okay. I really mean it when I say the thing that I'm going to encourage you and challenge you throughout these next 5 weeks, even on Sunday Mass and different things like that, is to pray. I would rather you, if it came down to reading even what the Catechism says versus praying, I'd rather you choose praying. I'd prefer you do both, especially with the Catechism, because there's really, really profound things that will help your prayer. But I really mean it that the most important thing is to commit your will to pray and to spend time in dedicated, habitual, that is building habits of time for prayer every day. And again, we'll talk through this all throughout the summer about how we do that. How do we find a way in our busy schedules, in our very busy lives, to spend time with God? Because I assure you that time spent with God is never time wasted. So that is the sort of layout for the course. Are there any questions right off the start? Awesome, very cool. Okay, cool. So that's how we'll proceed forward. Now, tonight will be slightly different than some of the other times in that I'm going to tell a little bit more from a personal side as we start and enter into tonight's session. Because again, tonight's session is to convince you of the need to pray, to persuade you that this is something that is good for your life, good for your soul, good for the peace of heart. And if nothing else, just to show how it is I got here to become a priest. Because I'm convinced the single answer is prayer. So by that, I just want to start a little bit with somewhat of my own vocation story and why it is that I'm so passionate about prayer in particular. So, I was raised by a wonderful Catholic family. I grew up in the southern part of Madison in McFarland. I was the fourth child, the youngest, of a mother who was a brand new convert to the Catholic faith and a father who was a lifelong Catholic. I was baptized when I was 6 years old. I actually remember my baptism. It's one of the first memories I have, which is kind of cool. And I experienced the sort of love of the Catholic faith that my mother brought in from converting. She was actually raised an anti-Catholic Protestant. She thought it was her life's goal to get my dad out of the Catholic faith. And about 30 years into marriage, she converted and saw the truth of the Catholic faith and really fell in love. So I was sort of the product of a loving family that loved the Catholic faith, and we did everything that we could to go to Mass every single weekend. I played way too many sports. I can't believe my parents allowed me to play as many sports: football, hockey, baseball, and then all three in the summer with a little bit of golf in the summer as well. But no matter where we were, what we were doing, we always went to Mass. Without fail, was never a question. We went to Mass. And that made a profound influence just to know how important Mass was in my life. And we would often, not always, but on Sundays pray a rosary together. That rosary, I'm more and more convinced, was one of the most important things of my life and upbringing, especially understanding prayer. But I'll be perfectly honest, I didn't understand it at the time. I fought against it. I didn't want to pray that rosary with my family, but we did anyway. And I would say for a good chunk of my childhood, I didn't want to go to Mass either. But I did it because that was what we did as a family. And so as I grew up, I'm grateful for the upbringing my parents gave me. It's absolutely incredible. They taught me incredibly well. I never intellectually doubted anything that the Catholic faith taught was true. I didn't have this crisis of, is this true, is this not true? Is the Eucharist really the real presence of Christ, is the Eucharist not? Should I go to Mass on Sunday or should I not go to Mass? I never had that sort of interior battle. But I would say the one thing, and I've told this to my parents, we've talked about it, that I don't think I was really taught to have that deep relationship with Jesus Christ. I would go through the motions without understanding what I was doing, okay? And I think that's a fairly common thing for many of us. So basically what happened was when I got to high school and college, I knew I needed the Lord in my life. I knew I needed the Catholic Church. I knew I needed to go to Mass, and I went to Mass. But there wasn't this relationship built behind it. So what happens if you continually just do what you're supposed to, or do what your habit has formed you, but you don't have the why behind it, or you don't have the relationship behind it? You're going to start to grow apart, right? Both of these two things need to work together. The sort of interior passion, love, joy, along with the actions that we live. So, as I sort of tell this story, the priesthood was the furthest thing from my mind growing up. I was convinced that I would never be happy as a priest. My real desire was to be married, to raise a family just as my parents, and that's a great tribute to my parents. So they showed me a beautiful family life, and I was convinced that was the only way that I could be happy. And so I spent most of my adult life pursuing marriage and dating and seeing if that was where God was calling me to. But there was a question about priesthood that I never could quite shake. This idea of maybe I could become a priest. And at certain times it was more prevalent than others, but it was something that even as I approached marriage with the women I was dating, there was something that was holding me back. There was this interior peace that was missing. Okay? So I just share that because basically as I started to grow and look at where I was going to, how I was going to live the Catholic faith, there's a couple of key memories that I want to share and relate them to prayer. So one was, I was going through flight school, As you know, I spent my time in the military. I had the opportunity to go to the Air Force Academy and then got sent to Texas for flight school. So to give you an idea, I am 23 years old at this age, and I'm looking at possibly being married and looking at that's going to be the way, and I'm going to church every weekend. But again, I'm not praying. There's no relationship behind what I'm doing. And I went to church one weekend, and I realized I'm sitting in church, and I'm thinking, shoot, I have to go to Mass every Sunday for the rest of my life. Yeah. And it bothered me. I was like, shoot, that's a really big imposition. I know that that's what the church teaches, that we need to go to Mass every Sunday. I believe that. I do. I don't want to, though. Right? Like, you got to plan your whole weekend. And I'm 23 years old. I got my whole life in front of me. And I'm thinking, wow, I don't want to do that. So I just sort of begrudgingly went through. I still went to Mass and did that. But there was a discord between what I was doing and inside. So at that point, I was stationed at a base in Texas. I finished my flight school and I was moved to a base in New Mexico. And when I got to New Mexico, there was a number of series of events in my life that brought me to the point where I needed to take my faith more seriously, okay? And I love sharing the story. There's so much to my story. Everybody's got an incredible story. I love hearing people's stories, so I'd be happy to talk more in detail for some of this if you have questions. But basically, I got to this base. I was in middle of nowhere, New Mexico. It was a real desert experience. None of my friends were stationed at this base. And I didn't know what to do, but I knew I needed to take this a little bit more serious about my Catholic faith. So a couple big things happened. And one of them was the parish that I was stationed by offered Eucharistic adoration once a week from 5 to 6 p.m. on Monday nights. So I saw this, and I'd remember like vaguely on a retreat or something like that, going to Eucharistic adoration maybe once. And I was like, I should go to this. I should check this out. I don't know why I should do this, but maybe I should. I had this sort of impulse to go. And I looked and I said, so from 5 to 6 p.m., you're going to pray in front of the Blessed Sacrament. And my initial thoughts were, what the heck are you going to do or say for an hour? Like, how is that possible? What is that all about? And I decided just to go and just to test it out and see what happens. That first time I went, I got there, I think it was about like 5:10. And all of a sudden at the end, the priest offered benediction and put the Blessed Sacrament away. And I kind of looked back and thought, how is that an hour? That time just flew by. I couldn't believe how quickly it went. It's like, that's kind of crazy. Like an hour is not enough. First time in my life that's ever happened. So I decided to go back the next week. Holy hour. Decided to go back the next week. Holy hour. All of a sudden I started to build this habit of going once a week for 1 hour to pray with Jesus. It wasn't immediate, but over time, that 1 hour became the single hour I looked forward to more than any hour the rest of the week. What I found in that hour was peace, joy, comfort, rest in the arms of our Creator. What I found was a time that all of my problems of the world couldn't get me. Everything that I was worried about, the anxieties, the fears, life, career, marriage, all of that disappeared because I was with the Lord. And I started telling friends, like, you guys got to do this. Like, this is incredible. This adoration thing is really powerful. And basically, I couldn't put words to it literally until later. But what was happening was that the Lord was teaching me how to pray. The Lord was making himself present to me in my heart and teaching a deeper form of prayer that I hadn't experienced. That prayer of relationship, that prayer of the heart, that prayer of comfort. And you know what also changed when I got to New Mexico? Mass. all of a sudden, in the span of about 1 year, I went from Mass being a huge imposition every Sunday for the rest of my life to I can't wait to go to Mass on Sunday. I get so much more out of Mass. I understand more of what's going on. I can share more of my life with what's happening at the Mass. So this fundamentally transformed the way I approach Mass. And we'll talk about that as we get to the talkings about Mass later on in the course. But that was huge. And then there's one more story I wanted to share about this time frame. This is about a 2-year time frame here where I got to New Mexico before finally discerning that God was calling me to seminary and working that process. And the story was, I had started to, as Eucharistic adoration started happening, Mass started to become more and more prevalent, I started to read good Catholic books and started to really enjoy what was written. And I found there was a local bookstore that had a whole Catholic section, and I would go every once in a while, pick up a random book and read it, and I loved it. So I started accumulating books faster and faster, a problem that has only gotten worse in these days. But one day, it was just a Saturday, I was planning on doing nothing, hanging around the house, just kind of laying, relaxing, having a cup of coffee, watching TV, and I got this strange impulse to go to the bookstore. And it was weird. Like, okay, should I go to the bookstore? Like, I wasn't planning on going to the bookstore. Like, just kind of this quiet, go to the bookstore. I couldn't explain it at the time, but it was this sense to go to the bookstore. So I did. So I go to the bookstore and go to the Catholic section and walk over. First book I see is a book on the Rosary. I'm like, oh, sweet, Rosary. Prayed the Rosary growing up. Pick that up, open it up. My fingers open up to a page that says 54-day Rosary Novena for a spouse. And I thought, that's why I should go to the bookstore. This is awesome. Because deep in my heart at this point were questions of marriage, questions of life. And it was this, I'd never heard of it before. It was a 54-day Rosary Novena. So basically you pray a rosary every day for 27 days, specifically asking God for one intention. And then you pray a rosary every day for 27 days, thanking the Lord. Just saying thank you. And it could be for a spouse. This would encourage that. But it could be for any intention. So I thought, yep, we're going to do this. This is going to be awesome. And admittedly, when I started that, again, I don't know why. This is, I think, 2013, Tim might have punched me in the face or something like this for this. But I said, you know what? I'm going to pray this for the spouse that the Lord wants, whether that be a natural human marriage or a marriage with the church. I had this sort of inkling that there was still that question. I said, okay, Lord, you can I'm going to let you in a little bit here. And so I started praying this 54-day Rosary Novena. What I found was that it was really tough. It was very difficult, but not because of the ways that I thought. What surprised me about that Rosary Novena was that it was really, really, really difficult for me at that time to find 15 minutes every day. To find 15 minutes to put aside and actually pray the rosary with the Lord. It ended up being that before I went to bed every night, I had to look at the next day and say, shoot, when am I going to pray the rosary? And I didn't know when, and sometimes it got pretty hard. But what that taught me was that you don't just fall into prayer. If we were going to pray without ceasing, as Paul asks us, as the scriptures imply for us, we can't do that unless we put a dedicated will and effort into choosing a time consistently to pray, which then helps us to build a daily habit, which then allows the Lord's presence to be a part of our life more and more, whether we work, whether we play, or whether we're truly spending time with Him in prayer, perhaps in a church setting. So I was shocked at how difficult 15 minutes a day was. And at the end, I realized, wow, I actually need to do this and schedule time to pray. So that was an important lesson, and that kind of ties into this course as well. And that'll be one of the challenges I'll give you at the end, is finding that time, scheduling that time. And we'll talk about that all throughout the summer, okay? The last thing, in terms of sort of my own personal story of vocation, in terms of praying is, we talked about questions, right? The very first question I put on the flyer was, am I praying right? Am I praying correctly? And I put that there because I found that that's a very common question, and it's a question that I had myself. And the quick story here is that this class that I mentioned, that this priest taught us how to pray, was life-changing. It really was. And he went through all these different things, and I committed. In fact, right before I left the seminary, I met a priest who convinced me to pray a holy hour every day of my life, to take 1 hour every day for the rest of my life and pray. And he said, as a priest, you're going to find that you're going to feel like you're selfish because you're not serving the people, you're not doing something else, but I assure you, you need that time. So I made this commitment from this priest that I'm going to pray a holy hour every day for the rest of my life. A commitment that I'll talk throughout the summer has been very challenging, and there are days I have not, but at the same time, the Lord has been very generous in allowing me to do this quite regularly and consistently. So I have that in my mind, and then I got a holy hour every day. So that's 1 hour in front of the Blessed Sacrament in seminary after being taught by a priest who is one of the deepest priests I've ever met. And so basically, about 6 to 7 months into every day going to the chapel, praying, I kept having this bugging question in the back of my mind, am I praying right? Am I praying right? This doesn't feel like it's working. How come this doesn't feel like it's working? How come I'm not overwhelmed every day with great joy? How come some days I'm really bored? How come some days, more often than not, I shouldn't say more often than not, that's a bit of an exaggeration. How come some days I fall asleep? Quite a bit I would fall asleep in prayer. So not more often than not, but it was fairly common. So I'm like, why is this not working? This can't be working. So it was about 6 to 7 months into prayer. I believe it was in January. I went to the chapel for my daily holy hour, and I sat down to pray, and I was asking those questions to God. How come it's not working? How come I don't feel like we're connecting, like we're praying? And again, I had this peace and sense deep in my heart of these sort of questions coming back to me of, Tim, you've been going to the chapel for 1 hour every day for the last 6 months, right? Like, yeah, I have. You've been faithful to that. Or you've been coming and placing yourself in the presence of God every day for 6 to 7 months. Like, yeah. Don't you see how I'm working in your life? Don't you see that my grace has sustained you in this prayer, in this relationship? And that changed the way I approached prayer as well. Far from looking for the tangible, physical affirmations of feeling, I had come to understand on a deeper level how God's grace was working in my life and allowing me to come to the chapel every day. And I started to realize that one of the great truths of prayer is that it just takes faith, the grace of God, and your will. You just have to desire to pray, rely on your faith, and the Lord will do the rest. And so one of my continual encouragements all summer, and then for as long as I'm here, is to continue to spend the time in prayer. Just continue, no matter what discouragements come along your way, and we'll talk all about that this summer, no matter what distractions get in your way, no matter what sins get in your way, to just keep going forward. to commit to something and then allow the Lord to work in your life in a profound way. It may take 6 months. It may take 2 years. You may not feel anything tangibly different in your life until the day you die. But I assure you, and we'll talk more about this all throughout the summer, that the Lord is working. You just need to commit and trust in that grace. And what the Lord will do in your life is profound. And I know there are so many people here that are witnesses to this too. It's a great gift and honor to be a priest here, to see people come in and pray quietly in the church throughout the day. I wish more people could see how common that is and what a great gift it is to see people spending time in front of the Lord, because that is so important to them and that is so important to all of us. So the only reason I believe I'm here, both as a Catholic priest now and at this parish, is through the gift of prayer. I would never have been able to say yes to God's call for my life to become a priest if I didn't learn that interior prayer, that prayer of relationship, that prayer of spending time in silence, in love, in union, in communion with Him. So what I lack in terms of knowledge, in terms of the spiritual life, in terms of experience, I will make up in passion. I assure you that. I will challenge you. I really will. Each of us need a different level of challenging. Sometimes we need just like a kick in the butt. Sometimes you need mercy. It's this balance at different times and different stages of our life. Okay, since I am a little bit longer already, as I kind of thought I might be, I'm going to go ever so briefly into what is prayer, what it is not. And this is going to be kind of the part from the Catechism. And I think just for time's sake, instead of trying to follow along, I'm going to just kind of pick a couple highlights, and then I'll encourage you to spend time with these paragraphs of the Catechism, if that is what you're able to do in terms of time. So, what is prayer? The Catechism actually gives a definition, and I want to highlight that. It's raising one's mind and heart to God, or the requesting of good things from God. So it's a two-part definition that the Catechism gives. That's paragraph 2559. The raising of one's mind and heart to God, or the requesting of good things to God. So often, we get taught that prayer is just asking for things. And I think that's the second half and less important part of prayer. The raising of one's heart and mind to God is the most important part. And to understand prayer as communion. So we'll go through that this summer as well. The Catechism kind of then talks about 4 different things prayer is. So one of them is prayer is God's gift. So this is a profound truth that, and we'll end with a scripture passage that talks about we don't know how to pray as we ought, but the Holy Spirit intercedes for us. To pray is to receive a gift from God. While it does depend on our will, that point of you won't be able to pray continually unless you set your will to it, you also need to understand that it is something to be received. So this is going to sound crazy, but you need to pray about praying. Okay, so hang with me for a second, because how does that even work? It's just circular logic, right? How can you pray about praying? And if prayer is something received, how does this happen? Well, this speaks to a very important truth that surrounds all of the Catholic faith, and that is the primacy of God's grace. I preached about this maybe like a month and a half ago, that God is the one who takes the initiative and enters into your life. Just by the fact that you're here tonight or watching tonight, God has made that initiative and is calling you to something deeper. So you need to respond to that grace and in humility, ask for God's help. Because if we try to do this on our own power, we're going to fail. So prayer is something to be received as a gift. The Catechism talks about us as being beggars before God. It's a beautiful image. The next thing is prayer as covenant, which I've just said many times. Prayer is relationship. The 2 relationships that I think are the key to understand prayer is a father-son or father-daughter relationship, or perhaps just as important or more important, especially for meditative and contemplative prayer, is prayer as a spousal relationship, as husband and wife, as bridegroom and bride, as beloved and lover. So many of the great saints of the faith talk about this relationship prayer, which can also be very tough, I would say, especially for guys. This is kind of an image that's not always the most comfortable, to understand Christ as a divine bridegroom. But the sense that the Lord is the one who made us, and he made us for love, and he calls us to enter into that communion of love that is the Trinity. And the truth of this is, just as on a wedding day, you give everything to your spouse, body, blood, or you give soul, body, mind, and soul, right? A marriage doesn't take place unless you give all of yourself. What I want to share with you is that the Lord wants all of you in prayer. Body, blood, soul, problems, trials, struggles, sins, joys, highlights, emotions, passions. He wants everything. He wants honesty. He wants your honest self, and that is the self he wants in love, in relationship with prayer. So I encourage you, and will continue to encourage you throughout the summer, to be honest with God in prayer. I'll skip a little bit more through, because the other one is prayer as preparation for heaven. That one's pretty awesome, I think, is understanding prayer as preparation for heaven. The Catechism talks about that as prayer as communion. I think 2565, it talks about this builds a habit of which in heaven what we're going to be doing is praying with God. And by praying, I mean being in relationship. Okay. I'm going to skip forward here too. The last thing I'm going to say, if you go to the third page, if you want to follow along, again, you don't have to because I'm going to go a little bit quicker, is there's a talk about places favorable to prayer. Please look at that paragraph. It's paragraph 2691. It talks about prayer is difficult in a sense. You're going to run into so many obstacles. It's why the following paragraphs that I've highlighted talks about the battle of prayer. That is how the Catechism refers to prayer, as a battle. Okay? So there are certain places, and we'll talk about this more too, there are certain times that are better for prayer than others. That'll be something that we'll talk about and we'll develop together, okay? But what it talks about is the church as a privileged place for prayer. The reason for that is the tabernacle. Jesus Christ is truly present, body, blood, soul, and divinity here in this church. It's a quiet atmosphere. The church is open from 6:30 to 7 p.m. every day. It's beautiful to see people stop by and just pray. If you're going on your way to work, stop by for 2 minutes, say hi to Jesus, and then go to work. If you're coming back from work, stop in, say, Jesus, thank you. If you're coming to Mass, come a little bit early. If you're coming to Mass, stay a little bit later. But consider the church as a place to pray. I found that very helpful. That's also not easy and also not practical for everybody. So the other place that the church talks about is sort of a prayer corner in your house. And I'd highly encourage this. Set a room, set a corner, someplace apart with an image, a crucifix, something, and have it not be a normal place where, not the dinner table, not the living room, but a dedicated place. Because when you really set your mind to pray, there's going to be distractions like you've never experienced before. And if you can set that dedicated space, it's going to help. We need images because we are body and soul, that we need something to tangibly look at and help us draw into that raising of the mind and heart. If it's just at the dinner table or if it's just in the car on the way to work, not bad things, wonderful, good things, but if it's just there and not a special place, not a special time, not a special time set apart, it's going to be a bigger challenge. So at this point, I'll skip a few other things I had planned, and we'll just go to the challenge and the challenge for the week, and then we'll get into prayer. So the challenge, when I did this class 5 years ago, it came out of nowhere, and it turned out that people were really happy. They said that was one of the best parts, is that we were challenged each week with prayer. So the two challenges that I want to give you is this week is first of all to really pray. This again sounds strange. Pray about praying. Find a time that you can pray and consistently spend time in prayer. We're going to build that time throughout the summer if this is something you're not comfortable with. So perhaps taking a Bible and just reading the Bible, or just talking to the Lord in silence is a great start. It doesn't have to be the same time every day, because every day is a little bit different, but find a time and figure out when that's going to be for you and commit to that. So that's the one challenge. The second challenge is a little bit tougher, and it's going to tie into next week's topic, which is obstacles to prayer. Because I'll tell you, the number one obstacle to prayer, the number one obstacle is sin. It's that simple. If you are trying to grow in relationship with God, the only thing that gets in the way is sin. So, the challenge that I'm going to give you, which is not an easy challenge, again, pray about this, is to consider in the next week, maybe 2 weeks, whenever the time works out, going to confession. To prepare your heart for prayer. To say, Lord, I want to enter into more deeply this relationship with you, so cleanse me of my sins so that I can focus on you and you alone. Next week, we've actually expanded the times for confession. It's kind of cool. The first time doing this as a priest, I can offer that. So Monday night, 5:45 to 6:45 p.m., there'll be confessions. Thursday, from 4 to 5 p.m., there'll be confessions. Saturday, from 3:45 to 4:30, there'll be confessions. If you can't go here, go somewhere else. But please consider, all of the great saints of the church have talked about how frequent confession is so important. Our bishop is challenging everybody by next year to go to confession once a month. It's one of his initiatives for the evangelization program, is once a month going to confession. It's something that we probably don't talk about enough and we don't emphasize enough, but it is so important. Yesterday, I went to confession for the first time as a priest. One of the most humbling experiences of my life, to realize I can't forgive myself. I can't offer the sacrament for myself. It was incredible to kneel before the priest and ask God for forgiveness, because I knew I needed to do this, especially before leading this class. So if you have other questions about confession and how that works, just let me know. Feel free to talk. I'm open shoot me an email as well. We can set up another time if you can't make one of those other times. The last thing, I assure you this is the last thing, and then we will pray for about 10 minutes, is just a quote from St. Francis de Sales. He says, he's a great saint, he said, everybody should pray for 30 minutes every day, unless you're really busy, and then you should pray for an hour. What we're going to build up to is potentially that time where you could, for a full hour, just sit in the presence of God. That's my hope and joy for all of you, to experience the deep and warm, loving presence of God for 1 hour, not be bored, not be distracted. And that's something we'll work up to. So wherever you are in your spiritual journey, doesn't matter. But let's commit to prayer. Let's start with 5 minutes a day, if that's where you're at, 10 minutes a day. Prayer isn't measured in time, so don't even worry on a certain level about the time, but there's something to be said about that time in relationship with the one you love and the one who loves you. So at this point, I'm going to bring the Blessed Sacrament out, and I'm going to pray with you. I'm already a little bit over, so what I'm going to do is at 6:35, I will offer benediction with the Blessed Sacrament, but if you have to go, please feel free to exit at any time. I'll be out in the gathering space if you have questions, but I just encourage you just to take however much time you need right now and just recognize that we're in the presence of Jesus Christ. And figure out what is God asking of you. Ask him those questions and see how he can help guide. So I thank you, and I look forward to next week's class with you all. us pray. O God, who in this wonderful sacrament have left us a memorial of your passion, grant us, we pray, so to revere the sacred mysteries of your body and blood, so we may always experience in ourselves the fruits of your redemption, who live and reign with God the Father in the unity of the Holy Spirit, one God, forever and ever. Please repeat after me the divine praises. Blessed be God. Blessed be God. Blessed be his holy name. Blessed be his holy name. Blessed be Jesus Christ, true God and true man. Blessed be Jesus Christ, true God and true man. Blessed be the name of Jesus. Blessed be the name of Jesus. Blessed be his most sacred heart. Blessed be his most sacred heart. Blessed be his most precious blood. Blessed be his most precious blood. Blessed be Jesus in the most holy sacrament of the altar. Blessed be Jesus